diary Aaron Greenwood, several of his diaries. If you don't know who he was a surveyor and gardener. And he kept diaries from 1840 to 1870, 1880. And it was very interesting. So every day there's entries, and as you read through this, you get a sense of how life was as South Gardner and what they had to do to survive. The average wage was about 13 cents an hour. There was a lot of mills in Gardner already. The railroad had gone through east-west, but not south to Hubbardston yet. People made from $1 to $1.50 a day working in the mills. But what you get as you read through here is a sense that certain things were much different than they were today. Like, they paid a lot of money for food. Food was not easy to get. Well, this guy was a surveyor. He also worked a lot harder than we did. He was my age at the time. He was in his 60s. And the typical day would be, he would leave South Gardner in the morning. He was a surveyor, so he had a bag, a tripod, and his level, and just some chains, because that's what they used for surveying. And he walked to Hubbardston or someplace like that from South Gardner in the wintertime. No muck boots, he had leather shoes or boots. He'd walk to Hubbardston 6 or 7 miles, survey through a field all day, and walk back at the end of the day with his thing. One thing they did was, like I said, food was hard to come by. There was no Hannaford's, Stop and Shops. They put food away for the winter, squashes, whatever, put it in the cellar, potatoes. Meat was hard to come by. So in this case, forenoon went up to Abijah Hines after some pigeons for George. Had Simeon and George's horse and wagon. Told Abijah when he came home to kill a dozen of his pigeons, which he had got shot up, and bring them to me. George wants 2 or 3 of them. William wanted half a dozen. I would take the remainder. About 3 o'clock this afternoon, his boy brought me a dozen. I paid $1.62 for the dozen pigeons. When the blueberries out, they ate lunch of blueberries. They'd go out picking blueberries. They pick every blueberry bush because they're sweet for one thing. You can make pies, and they would eat the lunch of blueberries that day. And they'd go in a swamp where people couldn't get to easily. In a little island, there would be blueberries. They'd go through the swamp to get to the blueberries so they could eat blueberries. Wife has got the jaundice, or yellows, as it's called. She's a little more comfortable today and has laid down once but sat up most of the time. So that was common to be sick. They had jaundice. The war is going on, Civil War, which is about the Emancipation Proclamation, largely about slavery. And so they went to visit the troops that were mustering in Groton. They went down on the train to see the troops who were mustering. And it's very interesting. It refers to the Irish. The Irish at the time were lowlifes. So they weren't even talking about blacks because there wasn't any blacks, hardly any blacks in Gardner. It was mostly English, people of English descent in Gardner at the time. And the Irish came in and some other minorities came in. They didn't hold them in high regard. So in this case, he took dinner at the mustering there, which consisted of meat and bread, both of which were of good quality. There was one thing that I noticed which did not appear to me to be just right. It was the putting of all the fragments of the provisions into the swill barrel, which fragments many times consisted of large, plain, sweet pieces of meat and bread. One of the soldiers told me that there were probably enough wasted at each barracks to sustain 5 families. The whole loaves of bread, which they do not have occasion to cut, they sell to a man who goes around and purchases them and peddles them to the Irish. But if any loaves have been cut or broken, it goes into the swill barrel. Now I'd like to introduce our main speaker tonight, Ms. Carla Charter, who's going to speak about Hubbardston's role in abolitionist movement.
I started doing historical talks. I've always been a history buff. And I had done one on abolition in the Gardner area. And after I got done with it, the research for it would probably take an hour or 2 or maybe 3. And I remember that particular talk, I just started thinking what a waste it was that I was doing all this research and then it was just sitting on a shelf afterwards. So that was when I got the idea to put the information in a book. The one about Gardner, which includes Hubbardston, was my first, and I'm working on one about Athol now. Hubbardston was one of the hot spots of abolition. Gardner was the big one. That was where the Worcester County North Anti-Slavery Society. But Hubbardston was one of the hot spots. There were a lot of speakers over here. Among them were Abby Kelly and Stephen Foster, who were both abolitionists and women's rights activists. They lived in Liberty Farm in Worcester, which became the stop of the Underground Railroad. William Lloyd Garrison was here. I have an article that mentions William Lloyd Garrison speaking. So he had come to the area. Charles Lennox Ramon, who was a free African abolitionist and speaker. C.C. Burleigh, another abolitionist and women's rights advocate. I noticed a lot of the abolition was also tied in. A lot of the people who were into abolition were also into women's rights, were into temperance. They were sort of all interrelated sometimes. Aidan Blue, who was abolitionist and founder of the Hopedale community, utopian community, which blended factory work and the utopian community. The community stood for temperance, abolition, women's rights, spiritualism, and education. I believe it was Aidan, one of the Blues too, was also friends with Abner Nealon and Gardner, who was also another abolitionist. He was in the 1830s and got himself thrown in jail in Boston. Last man ever to be charged with blasphemy. And he was doing blasphemous things. I mean, he was writing to the Universalist editor in his paper saying, you believe in a different God than I believe in, but the God you believe in is figure in your imagination. But I think the real reason he got thrown in jail is because he was also a women's rights advocate, and he was an abolitionist, and he was pushing the ideas from the Boston pulpit in the 1830s. So he was into abolition and interracial marriage and things that wouldn't have been real popular, and I think they were trying to quiet him. It didn't work. Frederick Douglass was here several times, and of course we all know he was an escaped slave, an abolitionist, an orator and writer. Wendell Phillips was here, Parker Pillsbury, and Captain Jonathan Walker was here. I don't know if you know who he is. He's kind of a fascinating story. He was jailed in Pensacola for attempting to free slaves. And Laurie Moody spoke at one point in Hubbardston to a group of 150 people on December 1844 at the Unitarian Church on behalf of him because they were raising money for his bail. But as part of Walker's punishment, he was branded. His hand was branded with SS, which meant slave stealer. So that was there his whole life. When they had the talks, they didn't seem to be quiet events. They were rather lively events. According to what I found, at one point it was said these reformers were especially severe in their denunciations of the churches, sometimes declaring that the churches in Hubbardston were compacted in blood and in league with the devil. So they were really lively because they didn't adapt to the radical measures of the anti-slavery people. And the history went on, this was History of Hubbardston, I believe, saying that their words of bitter denunciation and biting sarcasm were often like barbed arrows to the people large numbers came to hear. So we know there were a lot of people, we know they were lively events, they weren't quiet events. And they apparently didn't end once the speaker was done, because according to the town history, when opportunity was given for discussion, the meetings frequently became excited and stormy and were liable to be protracted far into the night. So they were lively events. Unfortunately, it says even after the speakers left, leading members of the churches joined with them, the speakers, and divisions arose that led to sad results with churches, families, and neighborhoods dividing against themselves. Though the majority of the people were indignant and often irritated by the measures of the performance, yet the spirit of freedom and abhorrence of the whole system of human bondage was widening and deepening all the while. I discovered that a lot of the state, for Black History Month several years ago, downloaded all their abolition petitions that they received from every city and town in the Commonwealth. And that included Hubbardston. When I typed in Hubbardston, it came up with all the petitions from Hubbardston, not just that we got a petition, but the actual copy of the petition with the signers. And what happened was, during the Fugitive Slave Law, somebody could be in trouble for just harboring slaves. If they got found out they were harboring slaves, and a lot of these people were well-to-do, they could lose their business, they could go to jail. So unfortunately what happened is we don't have a lot of abolition records because they were destroyed. So we don't know who a lot of our abolitionists were. Nobody wanted to risk losing their business or going to jail. With this petition, with the petitions that the state downloaded, I was able to go on, download each petition, and in my box at home, each petition signer has their own section in that index box. And every time they signed a petition, I gave them an index card as to what petition they signed. It's not foolproof, but I'm going on the assumption that if they signed 1 or 2 petitions, maybe they were an abolitionist, maybe. But I have some that signed 8, 10, 12 petitions. So I'm assuming those were our pretty ardent abolitionists. But with that, and the list is in the book as well, but with that, it at least gives us an idea of who may have been abolitionists in town. And a lot of them, some of them, yeah, the names, you know, same last names, their whole families of abolitionists. Among those that signed them was Jonas Clark and his wife Susan. His older sister Carol and her husband James, they were all signers, they were all abolitionists. Alson Waite was also involved in abolitionist activities, and the Clarks were also involved in activities, not just signers. A single book by Susan Clark, which was Jonas's wife, with entries from 1845 to 47, still exists, and it has long transcriptions of poems written by Frederick Douglass, William Wells Brown, Reverend Aidan Ballou, and Mrs. Abby Price of the Hopedale community, among others. I believe at a library in Worcester, but it still exists. It's also said that Jonas Clark also served as vice president in the Worcester County North Anti-Slavery Society, which was in Gardner. Reverend Cornelius Bradford was a member of the Unitarian Church from 1840 to 1845 and was believed to be the most important clergy influence on Jonas and Susan Clark. Bradford was a Garrisonian abolitionist lecturer, and he continued his abolition work after leaving Hubbardston, the Hubbardston Church. Clark frequently accompanied Bradford on their abolitionist trips. Bradford, as well as Abner Jones, another former pastor from Hubbardston, both signed a protest against slavery by 170 Unitarian ministers in 1845, which was published in Garrison's Liberator. The other one that was involved was Reverend Samuel Gay. He was town minister until he was dismissed in 1827. He then became minister of the Calvinistic Society, which eventually became the Evangelical Congregational Church in town. He spoke at abolitionist meetings beginning in 1843 and was elected to various positions in the Worcester County North Anti-Slavery Society and remained in Hubbardston until his death in 1848. There is a record of a Hubbardston Anti-Slavery Society. Its first meeting I was able to document was on April 12th and 13th, 1844. I found another meeting on August 11th, 1850. There probably were others, but I haven't been able to document them yet. And the Worcester County North Anti-Slavery Society, they were headquartered in Gardner. That's where the headquarters were. But they went through all the North Quabbin towns with their meetings. They didn't just have the meetings in Gardner. And I do have them holding meetings in Hubbardston as well. The other thing, they had picnics called Freedom's Jubilees. And there was no doubt in my mind that Gardner, Westminster, they probably all had Freedom's Jubilee picnic at different times. The one, however, that I was able to document, the best documented one that I was able to find, was in Hubbardston. And it was a pretty large event. It was on August 19th, 1842. It involved not only residents of Hubbardston, but members of Gardner, Princeton, Rutland, Westminster, and Athol anti-slavery societies. There were also Washingtonian and Cold Water Armies. They were both temperance organizations. They were also there. They came from Gardner as well. And it was an estimated meeting of about 1,200 people. It started at the Methodist Chapel, and a procession was formed at 10 o'clock under the direction of Deacon A. White, and proceeded to march to a beautiful and extensive grove. That's all we have. The location of the picnic wasn't clear. It's only listed as the grove, located 1/3 of a mile from the village. Several of the groups marching from various towns included, this is one of the fascinating things, and we haven't found any, but several of the towns had banners. What happened to the banners, we may never know. Hubbardston's banner was described as a plane with a circle, the representation of a gold eagle or a gold leaf in the center, with a model of universal liberty inscribed within a wreath of evergreen bordering the circle as an emblem of that freedom which is never fading and never ending. And the speakers of the day were Reverend Smith of Westminster, Reverend Gay of Hubbardston, who was president for the day, Deacon Joshua T. Everett, who was very involved in the North Central Anti-Slavery Society, Reverend Mr. Chapman, Reverend Mr. Clark, Reverend Mr. Stone, Reverend Mr. Fish, Reverend Mr. Bradford, and Mr. Jackson. However, the primary speaker was William Lloyd Garrison. Interesting event that happened at the picnic was a banner which stated, there was a banner stating, "I am free." And it was presented to a child named Anderson and was under the care of George Hoyt, a prominent abolitionist in Athol. When I first ran across this, I assumed that Dr. Hoyt, being a doctor, he must have been taking care of the parents and they passed or something, and he had this child and he didn't know what to do, so he took him in. That was my original assumption. I was wrong. What it was is Anderson came to believe it was Boston, with the slave owner's wife. And the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society heard about it. And they said, okay, he's now in a free state, he's free. And they went to court over it, eventually went to the Supreme Court. And Anderson wanted to go back with his family. And the Supreme Court made the decision that he wasn't old enough to make his own decisions about what would be good for him and what wouldn't. So they went with the Anti-Slavery Society. And when she went back, he stayed here. She promised that if he went back, he'd be allowed to be free if he wanted to. But I don't think they were buying that. So he ended up staying with Dr. Hoyt. We know Dr. Hoyt was not only a doctor in the abolition movement, he was also involved in the Underground Railroad. And his son was a lawyer for John Brown during this trial. But I have not been able to find any fugitives that came through Hubbardston. I have in Gardner, I have in Westminster. And Shadrach Minkins, who was the first person grabbed under the fugitive slave law, went through South Ashburnham. He went to court over the fugitive slave law, and the anti-slavery people in Boston broke into the courthouse and wrestled him away from the sheriffs and got him out in the Underground Railroad. And he was the first one. He spent a couple days in South Ashburnham. He was supposed to spend a day, he got sick, and spent a couple days in South Ashburnham, and then went out on the train. A lot of these people went to Canada on the train. So I don't know if the train conductors were abolitionists, or if they just looked the other way because it was paying fare. I'm not sure which, but I mean, they obviously must have known something was up, especially with Shadrach Minkins, because there were posters all over the state looking for him. But I did find one fugitive in Hubbardston, one mention of a fugitive in Hubbardston, and he was a freed slave. According to Catherine S.B. Spears, she was speaking at a reunion of abolitionists years later. There was a man named Henry that was at her house when she was growing up. And he had escaped from slavery in New York and lived with her family when she was a child. She recalled that the children were very fond of Henry. That's the only mention we have of a fugitive in town was Henry. The other thing that was interesting with Hubbardston is Hubbardston was the first town in the Commonwealth to send a anti-slavery representative to the legislature. And the Liberty Party, which was the anti-slavery party, was smaller than the Republican and Democratic parties, but it was large enough in town to prevent either of the other parties from receiving a majority of the votes. And they had the election for 2 successive days. The 3 parties continued balloting, trying to get everybody they could to the ballot box, hoping their side would win. There were repeated motions not to send and to dissolve the meeting. And with no clear change in the position of the vote, after the second day, the whole meeting had to be dissolved. Selectmen soon scheduled a second meeting for 2 weeks later, with each party still holding firm. The second meeting was the last chance for the town to vote a state representative. As the day ended, an effort was made to effect a union of the Whig and Liberty parties. This resulted in the Liberty Party candidates, Sylvanus Duncan, to receive a majority by 1 vote. And he was declared elected. As a result of the election, Hubbardston became the first town in the Commonwealth to send an anti-slavery legislator to the State House. And only by 1 vote. But when he got to the State House, he realized the divisions he'd seen in Hubbardston were mirrored at the state level. So for many days, Dutton voted for Mr. Sewell, the Liberty Party candidate, but finally yielded along Whig lines, and George Briggs to become governor. Following 2 years, the town didn't have a representative, as it was impossible for the voters to elect anyone for that purpose. I've learned a lot, not only about Hubbardston, about the whole area. There were a lot of abolition movements. I was just telling one of the fugitive slave stories I do have, a very few that came through the area, is I was able to document that the legend with Gardner is Gardner had a fugitive slave home, Underground Railroad house, but there was never any proof. It was just a legend. And I was in Westminster doing some research and found an old book from 1890, a church anniversary book, and decided to open it and see if there was anything on abolition. And there was a story by a pastor in Westminster, had a Quaker stop at his house and with a fugitive. And he gave that Quaker money and told him where to go in Gardner, where to stop. And that was one of my goosebump moments, because that was our first proof that Gardner did have a stop. We don't know where it is, we suspect. but we don't know where it is, but we do know it was a fugitive. And interestingly enough, that fugitive that he was moving along the railroad also is mentioned in Fitchburg. For the same reason, she was white. But her son was tinged with color. So we're assuming it was, they were threatening to take the baby.